Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. Open source software plays an important part in research, and it's one of the pillars of the concept of open science. There are many open source projects, of course, and sometimes these projects grow to such an extent where it becomes either necessary or even desirable to form an organization around it. One of these organizations is 2I2C, which stands for International Interactive Computing Collaboration. And you may know 2I2C through its projects, such as, for instance, Executable Books or Jupyter Hubs for Education. I had the pleasure of meeting Chris Holdgraf, Executive Director of 2I2C and member of its steering committee. This is a somewhat longer interview because we touch on the many different facets of open source organizations and the unique challenges they face. In the first part, after Chris introduces himself, I wanted to know from him how he got into this space in the first place. And so here's Chris.
Yeah, so my name is Chris Holdgraf. I've been kind of in this space of open infrastructure and computing kind of glue technology in the Jupyter ecosystem for probably like a decade or so now. I entered into this world from academic research. I was doing research in neuroscience at Berkeley. And at UC Berkeley, there's always been a kind of Jupyter presence. So Fernando Perez, who's one of the creators of Jupyter, he had a teamlet based at the university. And so I started working with them more and more over the years and got more interested in how infrastructure can enable open science and scientific workflows. Decided to switch over into a postdoc that focused on that kind of work as opposed to focusing on scientific domain-specific research, and started getting more involved in open infrastructure services in addition to building technology at the university. So basically from that, we then launched 2I2C a couple of years later, which in many ways is trying to mimic the kinds of open infrastructure services that we were building and offering, but to a broader global audience instead of just internal to the university.
Since when are you the chief executive?
I think that it's been it depends a little bit on your definition, because the organization itself is relatively young. So there's sort of, do you find 2I2C's creation is when the first idea happened versus like when we got funding, that kind of thing. But I would say it's probably between 2.5 and 3 years.
All right. What got you into that position?
I think that there were a couple of different things, some of them sort of strategic and some of them more kind of pragmatic and just a byproduct of the times. For me, as I'd mentioned, I'd been at the university, both building technology with the Jupyter teams and with, in collaboration with the researchers and the educational groups at the university. And we'd also been then offering that technology as internal services via the cloud to people at the university. And I know for many years, we had talked about the usefulness of that model, basically, offering infrastructure and boosting its accessibility in the cloud, and then using that as an opportunity to kind of gather information and feedback about ways in which the kind of building blocks could be improved. And then at the same time, maintaining a connection to the open source communities that actually do the development in that space and closing that feedback loop. So we've been really interested in that model at Berkeley. And I personally had spent probably 2 or 3 years running workshops and tutorials and trainings and boot camps about how people at other institutions could deploy the same infrastructure, which is based around Jupyter and Jupyter Hub, how they could deploy the same infrastructure for their own communities. And we kept on hitting a kind of wall whenever we would run this kind of workshop, which is basically that other communities would get really excited, like a research group at a university or an educational group. They would get really excited about it because they loved the idea of using open infrastructure and sort of maintaining their own ownership over all of the different tools that they were utilizing. But they would hit this wall of running infrastructure in the cloud is really, really hard and time consuming, and it takes a very particular skill set. And it's not the kind of thing that you can reliably do just with like nights and weekends or, 10% of a postdoc's time. And so as we were getting more and more signals like that, it made me feel like another way to try to tackle this problem was to do so effectively via shared services, via people that can manage the infrastructure on your behalf, but who are not formally located within your institution. It was an idea that we had been exploring for a while. Like, how could you provide these kind of, at Berkeley, we called it the data hub. How could you provide this kind of a service externally so that other organizations don't have to grow their own cloud infrastructure expertise and set all of this stuff up in-house? So In my mind, a nonprofit was a really interesting vehicle for doing that because the kinds of target communities that we were working with are sort of strictly within education and research and open science. And they care a lot about things like transparency and good governance and a kind of collaborative model that isn't based on a kind of pure producer consumer model that a lot of traditional software as a service companies have. And there was this component of trust that we wanted to have with the open source communities that we were working with as well, sort of like making it clear whose interests we were representing as an organization. And so for all of that and a few other reasons, I was really interested in creating a nonprofit to do this kind of work. And there were a few other co-founders of 2i2c that in their own unique journeys had sort of come to the same conclusion, and we all kind of have different interpretations of where the kind of key value proposition is and stuff like that. But there were at least two other major projects. One of them is called the Pangeo Project, which is a big collaborative geospatial research community, and another one called Syzygy, which is a federated network of Canadian Jupyter hubs for Canadian universities. And that group had been collaborating with each other loosely over the last year or two and decided that we were all kind of on the same page that we wanted to create an external entity that could carry forward the torch and bear the mission that we had all been following implicitly and sort of make it explicit and turn it into a specific organization. And then the short answer to your question in a most pragmatic sense is that I was at the time wrapping up a postdoc and had opportunity to be fully employed in some capacity and had an interest in serving in that role. Just pragmatically speaking, that was the path of least resistance. So I started sort of focusing more of my time on 2i2c and trying to set a foundation for that organization.
Yeah, well, which is quite an undertaking. From what you explained, there are a number of different projects. I think people probably know Jupyter Hub, and you mentioned Pangea. And how many different other projects are there? Do they have to tie in with Jupyter at all, or can they be completely agnostic?
So I would say they're very different kinds of projects. So like Jupyter Hub is a tool. It exists as a piece of technology. You can utilize it for all kinds of different purposes. Something like Pangeo is really a community. It's an organization that spans universities and countries and research workflows. And it's all focused around a specific use case around earth sciences and satellite imagery and things like that. So in some ways, Pangeo is more like a community of practice than it is like a specific tool or a piece of infrastructure. Similarly with Syzygy, that was a collection of Jupyter hubs that had all been deployed for various educational communities inside of Canada. And so to me, the thing that binds them all together was more the model that they were following as opposed to any one specific piece of technology that they were using. So they were all, reutilizing open infrastructure, integrating it together and customizing it for a particular domain use case. And then in various forms, re-engaging with the open source communities that built that infrastructure and pushing, ideas and contributions back into that space so that as those tools improved for their own specific use cases, for Pangeo, or for Syzygy, or for the Data Hub, it still happened in an upstream space so that all of the other communities that use these tools would benefit from those improvements as well.
Is that what we mean by open infrastructure then? That people build these kind of infrastructure models and tools that then could be used by other completely different projects? Is that what the idea behind open infrastructure is?
I would say that there are a million different definitions of open infrastructure out there. It's not quite as bad as open source, but it's still definitely underdefined enough that everybody kind of imprints their own personal definition on top of it. But yeah, I think that my definition of open infrastructure or open services is a commitment to certain kinds of principles, right? Like you're committing to wherever possible, finding pre-existing upstream communities and participating in those communities and offering your ideas and your time to make those communities better and the technology that they build better, and then redeploy that technology into your own service, right? So that if you're running like an open infrastructure service, we're running Jupyter Lab or Jupyter Hub or any of these other tools, but we try to make it clear that we are not those tools directly, if that makes sense. Like 2i2c is not Jupyter Hub. We are a participant in the Jupyter Hub space and we provide leadership in that space, but we try to be really clear that we have two different hats on. And I think that that's a really healthy model for how parts of society that care about open practices and transparency and creating a more inclusive, participatory, scientific world, for organizations that care about that kind of stuff, it's a really attractive and I think powerful model, because it ensures that you can build things that are specific for communities, but with a practice that pushes those contributions back up into like broader shared upstream communities. And I think when you do that kind of thing, if you have lots of different groups doing that kind of thing, then you really start to sort of pool your resources together in the way that everyone sort of idealizes when they think of how open source works.
One thing that you mentioned earlier, there is a lot of work involved that goes beyond the 10% that you can spend maybe in your day-to-day job or over the weekend or during holidays. So building these kind of tools or working together in an open infrastructure environment takes a lot of time. So how do you manage all of that? So, well, I guess what I'm getting at is, how does 2I2C actually work? Because we have a lot of tech companies out there that do just that. So how do you face up to that?
At the end of the day, from the level of like organizational policy, you can really just define like principles that you want people to follow and general directives of like, here's how 2I2C tries to define what it looks like to have a healthy relationship with like an open source community. And I think that for those principles, it's a lot of the things that I just described. You want to tell people, if possible, try to build something upstream first. Sometimes it might be necessary to build something that 2I2C is the sole controller of. But ideally, you want to start by trying to find an upstream community and to engage with them, identify if they are interested in that contribution, and then make it on its own before then redeploying into the services that 2I2C runs. Another example of this is sort of an understanding that engaging with open source communities requires more than just showing up when you want something and then disappearing once you've accomplished your goal. There's an expectation or an understanding that, for example, the engineers within 2I2C, they're going to be spending more of their time doing the like social and political engagement and the sort of chopping wood and carrying water that may not directly be tied back to 2I2C's direct interests, but that we know as a kind of investment in those communities and helps us have a healthy relationship with them, is both going to make that community stronger, and it's also going to make our kind of standing in that community stronger, and we'll have a little bit more trust when there are things that we want to have opinions about. I think it's things like that, like how do you define policies and best practices that encourage healthy relationships with those communities? But it's tricky. I mean, it's a really challenging problem because, as you say, like running an ongoing service does take a considerable amount of its own time. And it's a kind of constant balancing act, because running an open source project is a truly never-ending source of work, right? Like it's just a black hole of time if you're not really disciplined about saying like, okay, I'm going to engage up to this point and then I'm going to like stop and do something else, so that I don't lose my mind. I think that a lot of us have been in some version of that because we've all spent a lot of time in the open source space and really began our time in the open source space, identifying more as kind of community members of Jupyter or Jupyter Hub. We started there and then we created 2I2C. And I think something that we try to be really thoughtful about is like, we're creating a new hat for us to wear. We can't wear our Jupyter Hub hat and our 2I2C hat at the same time, because while their interests and their strategies are aligned, intentionally so, they're not the same thing. And we're kind of representing different interests when we are wearing one or the other of those hats. And so I think a lot of it is organizationally trying to think carefully about how to avoid conflicts of interests and how to avoid overpowering an open source community, because now we have more financial resources to pay people like full time to work on this kind of stuff. Those are all really complicated problems to work through. But I think that what we're really interested in at 2I2C is to lean into those problems and recognize that they're complicated.
I find open source communities and organizations in particular quite interesting, because I always try to get my head around how they actually work. I mean, you alluded to already in terms of community work, etc., but they usually have a relatively small staff. I don't know how many people you employ, but I guess you have some full-time employees like yourself. But then there is a large community actually that contributes in terms of volunteers and core contributors that actually might work for a company. And how do you keep all of that together without falling apart?
I mean, that is a $1 million question. So
it is, isn't it?
I think that question doesn't have an answer. It has like a few different examples of different models that have been tried. and lessons to learn from those models. But I don't think that there is an answer. As you alluded to, there's often some difference between a kind of core, more directly engaged group and a broader contributing every now and then, providing more feedback, but not like, waking up every single day thinking about how they're going to improve this open source tool. So a lot of the variability in open source projects comes down to the organization of those different two groups and the kind of definitions of like how a person from one group can become a person of the other group. So I guess really I'm talking about governance, right? Who gets to make decisions about the project? Who gets to drive it forward? Who gets to define the project's strategy and acceptable code of conduct and things like that? I've kind of seen a little bit of everything. I feel like the vast majority of open source projects, they're just kind of chaotic and become a sort of do-ocracy style model where they even may have like nominal rules of engagement. But in practice, at least in my experience, when you have a lot of only loosely engaged people that all have their own day-to-day work going on, it's very easy for people to push their own agenda purely by being more engaged than everybody else. And so if you've got somebody that shows up and makes 10 pull requests in a week and there's nobody on the receiving end to really like step through that and discuss whether it's a good idea or not and do all of that kind of stuff, then in my experience, often the first person tends to sort of get their way more often than not, because you don't want to just say no to somebody's contribution. And there's like a general idea that it's probably going to be beneficial, but you don't have the time to litigate every single product decision effectively. So I think that in practice, that's often how it works. I will say, I think that that's an anti-pattern for medium and larger sized projects because, it like biases. Yeah. I mean, I think that Jupyter is beyond that model to some degree because it's been around for a while. 2i2c is a nonprofit, so we have our own decision-making structure. But I think that the challenge with a model like that is that you're biasing decision-making power to people that don't necessarily deserve that power. It's more like they'll get it informally because they're willing to be louder than everybody else, or they're willing to be more engaged than everybody else, which doesn't mean that they're going to be the right people to sort of chart the path forward for a project or build the right kind of community around it. And so I think that that's where you start to see more formal governing processes, like formal roles with specific authority to define, what is the roadmap, who gets to merge a pull request, stuff like that. And then in that model, I feel like there are sort of two different models that I've seen. One of them is you basically have a kind of steward organization that does employ people and effectively controls the project sort of on behalf of a broader open source community around it. I think this is how like the vast majority of corporate open source works. Like it's usually a project spun out of a company. They will call it open source and participatory, and they'll engage with people on GitHub. But from a governing perspective, it's still fundamentally like the company's own business strategy and product roadmap is going to be dictating the product roadmap of this open source tool. The other one is what I would describe as a multi-stakeholder open source project, which in my mind is the kind of like gold standard of what we all want to see more of, right? You have many different participants. They might have their own agendas, but you agree to collaborate together on this open source project and chart a path forward that kind of has its own agenda as an open source project, its own strategy that is useful enough to all of these stakeholders that they continue participating, but where it is distinct enough so that it's not just being driven by any one of those stakeholders. And that is the model that I would define as like open source or open communities, the one that 2i2c tries to participate in communities in a way that would encourage that kind of dynamic to happen. But it's really hard because that's where you run into your tragedy of the commons problem, where you have a lot of the glue and organizational and coordination work needed to align a bunch of different stakeholders on a path forward. And then the question is, who's going to pay for the time for that person to do all of that work?
But 2i2c is a little bit different because it is a non-profit organization, but it is officially an organization. It's not just a group of people getting together doing stuff, is it? So what kind of governance model do you then have?
Yeah, so I think that that's one of the reasons that 2i2c is a nonprofit is partially because we've seen a bunch of different companies engage in the open source space over the years. And I think that to some degree, that's a good thing. But I think that one of the anti-patterns there is that once an organization that is able to generate its own resources and pay people begins to engage in an open source project, according to the factors that I described before of a kind of do-ocracy style model, that entity ends up effectively controlling the project. Once that happens, you lose a lot of the participatory, open, inclusive practices that open communities have. And in my opinion, that's something that we should try to protect. We should try to have like more multi-stakeholder, broadly representative open source projects with many different kinds of people collaborating together. So 2I2C is its own organization, and it can pay people to work semi full time in engaging in these projects. So I guess one version of your question that you just asked me is like, how does 2I2C avoid falling into the exact same trap of like effectively taking over projects? Again, I will say I don't really know exactly what the answer is, because this is something that we're kind of actively grappling with, and that's part of the experiment of 2I2C is trying to figure out what does it look like for an organization to engage in a healthy way with these communities. I do think that like one of the answers there still is governance, right? Like what are the mechanisms of governance that 2I2C can define for itself so that it has more explicit representation about like whose interests is 2I2C representing? And what are some experiments that we can run with governance to make sure that if we're paying people on a semi full-time basis to work in upstream communities, that members of those upstream communities or members of the communities 2I2C is serving in our infrastructure services have representation at the level of like governance and strategy and broad direction of the services. Part of it is just like being a nonprofit, you have to define a mission. And when you define the board or the steering council, in our case, of 2I2C, that group of people is where the buck stops ultimately, right? They are the ones that are meant to steward the mission and hold me as executive director accountable for steering the organization in pursuit of that mission. And so those people we can kind of select based off of their ability to represent different kinds of perspectives that we care about, rather than based off of their ability to pay in funds to the organization in exchange for equity, which is what you would normally do if you were a private company. So we can select representation in 2I2C's governing body based off the kinds of communities that we want to intentionally give representation to in pursuit of our mission. And so like if you look at 2I2C's steering council, it's the kind of bootstrap founding steering council of people that created the organization. So it has representation largely from what I would define as like open science and open education and open source people, like, for example, representatives from all the projects that I mentioned before, Syzygy, OpenGeo, and UC Berkeley. And those people are going to be biased in the direction of like their respective missions, but intentionally so, right? That's like the whole reason that they're on the steering council. So I think that it's a combination of that core steering council model, making sure that you have representation on that board that maps onto the different stakeholder communities that you care about. And the other is creating experiments for other kinds of representation that you can give communities that go beyond just like a seat on your board. Maybe it's something like inviting participation from open source communities and defining what 2I2C's roadmap should look like. Where should we be directing our attention in the open source space? Whose problems should we be prioritizing as an organization? I think that getting feedback from open source communities, which I think of as another kind of key stakeholder community of 2I2C, is a really critical and a really useful exercise to go through. And so we're trying to find ways to build more connections and more mechanisms for communication and feedback and things like that.
The ideal open source organization is run by volunteers and peers who contribute to the codebase and take decisions collectively for the good of the project and the community it serves. That's the theory. But reality is a bit more nuanced than that, as we've just heard from Chris. And in 2020, Nadia Ekbar published a book called Working in Public, where she explains in more detail the various ways in which open source projects are organized. And one of the issues she identified is that in some open source projects, maybe 95% of all contributions come perhaps from only 5% of the contributors. And in this second part of the interview, I wanted to know from Chris how to deal with that.
It's a fundamentally hard problem. And I think that it's a problem that every single open source community that I know wrestles with. You can run like a boot camp or a workshop and teach people, get them trained in open source workflows, get them to like contribute a pull request for their first bug or something like that. And then afterwards, you kind of hope that they're going to continue engaging and find other things to work on. And like 99.9% of people don't follow up because they have other things that they've got to do. It's a kind of unreasonable request in some ways to just expect people to kind of show up and contribute. The best way that I've heard described for kind of what you have to do is it's more, again, like a model and a set of principles to follow rather than like you just need to do like XYZ very specific things and people will show up. But the way that Mozilla used to talk about open source workflows and kind of community design was to think about it in terms of value exchanges. Try to understand who are the kinds of contributors that you want to attract to a project, and what are the kinds of things that they would find valuable. As an open source project, you can't give them money. That's like the most common value exchange that organizations use to get people to
yes, it's a salary.
Or you offer them money. Most open source projects can't do that kind of thing. So what are the other ways that you can create like a meaningful experience that will incentivize them to continue engaging? And so I think that for a lot of open source projects, it's one reason that they do try to focus on community. And you hear the word community a lot in these spaces as a kind of key important entity that they all hold a lot of respect and a lot of value for. And I think part of that's because a lot of people engage in open source precisely because it forms its own community of practice. And it's a group of people that you identify with and that you can connect with and build social relationships with. So I think that finding ways to build connections between people in a community and finding ways to build social connections with newcomers in a community, finding ways to like lower the barrier of entry to joining meetings, finding ways to document very explicitly when certain things happen, when certain decisions get made. If you want to contribute in a certain way, then you should do XYZ, like that kind of stuff. Just lowering that energy barrier so that people can engage enough that they start to see the value and they start to build those social relationships is, I think, a really useful step for projects to take. The challenge with that is that most people engage in open source projects primarily because they're just interested in building technology. And really what I'm talking about is like social engineering, right? It's like building a model of how a group of people work with each other and trying to find ways to incentivize them to work with each other and that kind of thing. So a lot of times this work doesn't get done largely just because the interests and skill sets that you would want represented in order to do that kind of stuff are often not present in an open source project because people are focusing on the infrastructure and the technology as opposed to the like social mechanisms that are at play there. That's fundamentally what you need, is you need someone that can do a bit of social engineering and figure out like how to motivate people to engage.
Community managers, I think they're usually called in open source.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing is it's not a problem if somebody just shows up and makes a contribution and then, zooms off. Where it often becomes a problem is when communities don't define an explicit mechanism for deciding their priorities. And if you don't have an explicit mechanism for that, then anytime somebody offers a contribution, it forces a discussion around that contribution. Like, should we even do this in the first place? Before you even get to the quality control level of just like making sure there are no bugs and things like that. And engaging in those discussions is itself a form of labor, right? It takes time and energy to, talk to somebody and decide if it's a good idea or not. It takes time and energy to debate with other core contributors whether you should take an action or not. And it takes a lot of energy to tell contributor no. It really sucks when you say like, well, we're going to close this pull request because it's just not in scope. And so I think that part of the challenge that open source communities have is they don't have a process for saying like, okay, these are our priorities for the month. This is a kind of directional guidance for like ways in which we welcome contributions, so that if somebody wants to contribute, you can do so in these particular ways and you're not going to get a lot of resistance, right? These are the ways we want people to be contributing. And I think that having mechanisms like that, guidelines to tell people, yes, we know that you personally might be really excited in A, but the core contributors of this project are really excited in B. And so for the next however much time, we're not going to talk about pull requests relating to A. I think that kind of thing can help just like set expectations a little bit more clearly and make it easier for people. It both reduces the amount of work for people that are engaging on a regular basis, the people that are engaging in these prioritization discussions, but it also lowers the perceived cost of a drive-by contributor. If you've stated that you want X to happen and somebody shows up, does X, and then disappears forever, it's still a net benefit to the project that should be celebrated.
Indeed. So it seems like the governance is important, and we need to be as transparent about the governance as we try to be about the use of technology that we use in our projects. That's the takeaway. As long as people know, okay, this is the kind of process, then there is a mechanism in place where you have to say no, for instance, because the thing is not in scope. The bad thing is when people just don't know and the no comes out of the blue. Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yeah, there's like governance and then there's communication of that governance, like who gets to decide what the roadmap is, and then what are the mechanisms that a community uses to operationalize a roadmap. And this is like a fundamentally hard problem. It's something that organizations struggle with all the time. Even when an organization has a kind of like vertical power hierarchy and things like that, it's still a fundamentally hard problem to just get everybody on the same page. I think the governance is a big part of it. Being really explicit about who has power within the organization, who gets to make certain kinds of decisions, and also importantly, how could another person rise in the ranks within an organization to achieve that status themselves. I think people need to be able to see pathways forward through a community in order to be incentivized to engage more. I think a lot of that does come back to governance.
Do you think this is potentially a reason why commercial and for-profit organizations have an advantage there? Because yes, herding all the cats is difficult in any organization, large or small, but ultimately they do have incentives, right? They have jobs and they have salaries and they have career paths, whereas open source communities often have very little career paths and a vast a core of volunteers. Do you think there is some kind of inherent disadvantage for open source communities?
I feel like it opens different weaknesses and strengths depending on which one you're following. I feel like the benefit of the commercial context is that, as you say, you have a lot more resources to dedicate to a project. And you often do have a more kind of coherent internal decision-making system so that you can just say, I mean, this is how a lot of corporate run or company run open source projects works. Like for this open source project, we're going to have a bunch of issues and discussion, and people are welcome to, make PRs and all this stuff. Fundamentally, there's like some product manager inside the company that's going to decide what the actual bulk of the developer time is going towards. And so I think that definitely means you can act much more quickly. You can respond to market pressures and things like that much more easily. And so I think that's why if you have starting at the same point, trying to do the same thing, two different projects, one of them controlled by a company and one of them that's like a loose collection of open source people, the company is probably going to make progress much more quickly because you can sort of gear the operations of the entire thing in direction. I feel like the downside to that is that companies fundamentally are following a business strategy, and that business strategy can try to align itself with creating, an open source product that is valuable to people. But as we've seen time and time again in many different companies that form themselves around an open source tool before realizing that like an open source tool is not inherently a business model. The problem is they have to prioritize other things at some point in time. And so almost by definition, they're going to have to start weighing the value that this tool could provide for the world against the business needs and the business strategy of their organization and their customers. And so often, eventually, you start to get a divergence between what the tool could be and what the company needs the tool to be in order to serve its business needs. There's something really important to that. Proper self-identified multi-stakeholder open source project just wants to be as good as it can be for the kinds of communities that it serves. It just wants to be valuable. And it doesn't have the constraints of it's got to be valuable, but it has to figure out how to sort of fit its value into the business model of one particular stakeholder. And so in my mind, that means that there's a much higher ceiling for open source communities in a longer term, because they can focus all of their time on just trying to be as useful as they can be, as opposed to being a part of a broader business strategy.
So it's more long-term effect. So you might have to adjust your business strategy to meet, say, the revenue target for 2024. But with open source projects, you can take a longer breath effectively.
Yeah. And I think that you just have different kinds of pressures that you can succumb to. There are plenty of failure modes of properly open source communities too. But, I think we've seen in the last year or two what happens when you have a business that raises a bunch of money around the popularity of an open source project. They have enough people working on the project that they've effectively control the project. and they spend like a couple of good years focusing on making the project valuable, because making a project valuable gets users, and they don't really think about what their business model is going to look like. And after a couple of years, the project becomes really popular, but the company starts getting pressures either from investors or from the market or whatever, that they need to really start making money now. And at least in my experience, it almost always results in the company making product decisions about the open source project that are perceived as detrimental or even hostile to both the user community and the developer community. Because if you need to start recovering money, it usually means that you've got to start like withholding some things back so that you can charge money for getting those things. How they do that, there are lots of different mechanisms, right? The most obvious one most recently is you relicense the product and you say like, okay, now nobody else is allowed to run a service that uses this product except for us if you get paid. We've started to see now that a few product life cycles that were based around like well invested open source tools, we've seen those life cycles spin down, and people are like, oh, right, maybe it wasn't such a good idea to basically cede control to this one company for the roadmap of this tool. And so I think people are becoming a little bit more, at least aware of the downside of that kind of thing.
Last question, because I think we're running out of time now. So with all of that in mind, what do you think is in store for 2I2C in the next year, maybe in the next 5?
2I2C is in a really interesting place right now because, as I mentioned before, it's trying to experiment with a new kind of service model where the large majority of what we do are integrating together open source tools and treating them kind of like Legos in a big Lego box. We're just trying to bring those Legos together and build them into like interesting rocket ships that are designed for communities to then take themselves and make their own customizations, and sort of blur the line between a community just owning and running their own infrastructure versus relying on an external service provider like 2I2C to run it for them. And I think that what we found in the first couple of years of 2I2C's existence is that in general, that's a pretty attractive model to the kinds of communities that we're interested in serving. And so I think that what we need to do right now is figure out what are the aspects of that model that we can streamline and systematize and reduce the amount of human labor associated with it, so that we can offer it to more communities much more efficiently than what we're doing right now, which still involves like quite a lot of direct to community conversation and discussion and things like that. I think that we're really interested in the idea of giving communities a collection of technical and social infrastructure that gives them a backbone or a foundation that is fundamentally sound and that encourages a sort of healthy community dynamic to form on top of it, but where it's fundamentally a model of empowering those communities and their leaders to take that infrastructure and do interesting things with it, rather than 2I2C making all of the decisions for them and giving them a service that is take it or leave it. The next year or two, that's sort of what we're doing right now, is taking a look at the model, trying to figure out, we've run cloud infrastructure now for something like 60 or 70 different communities. Some of them are more successful than others. Why? What makes a community successful? What of the infrastructure is particularly valuable? Are there different kinds of community archetypes that we can point to and say like, well, if you're this kind of a community, then you're really going to want X. And if you're that kind of a community, you're really going to want Y. And then defining a model that can scale around that and recover its costs. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We've got 3 years worth of experimentation and running active, Jupyter Hub, but with a bunch of customizations on it for communities, and trying to figure out where are the common pieces there that we can systematize and scale. And then on a 5-year time horizon, it's always really hard to say, because who knows what we're going to learn in between now and 5 years from now that might change that time horizon. But I think that everybody is just generally really excited in this idea of an organization that is truly international and serving a collection of international communities, but recognizing that those communities are their own distinct entities that wants to self-govern and that don't just want like access to this single software as a service platform or something like that. And there's a lot of complexity in figuring out how to do that properly, like how to staff a service model or a collection of services and products that are serving international communities, but still giving them representation in along the lines of everything we just talked about, like governance and transparency and participation and that kind of thing. What does your staffing model look like if you're hiring people across the world and you want to be serving an international community? The way that I think about it from a product perspective is that What 2i2c wants to do is, again, treat open source technology like Lego blocks and then find ways to combine them together in unique ways that have a kind of additive effect, and to focus its development efforts where we're pushing upstream contributions in new functionality and mechanisms that allow those connections to happen. Like, it's not just a Jupyter Hub, but it's like, how would you use a Jupyter Hub in addition to a documentation engine for your community, and allow both of them to sort of know about each other's existence and request services and API calls and stuff like that back and forth. I think that related to that is this notion of cloud infrastructure as just like one space where people want to do their work, but they also want to do their work locally, or maybe they have some on-premises infrastructure that they want to take advantage of as well. Mm-hmm. And to some degree, the distinction between all of these things, at least from a user's perspective, feels kind of trivial. Like, it's just what? They're all just computers. It shouldn't be that hard to run like Jupyter one versus the other. But in practice, there is a lot of differences between all of these things. And I think that those are places where technology can start to sort of blur those lines and let you kind of take your work with you wherever you happen to be going, whether it's in like one of 4 different cloud providers, or whether it is, a cloud provider versus your local laptop or your university's HPC facility, that kind of thing. It all comes back to like, what is the way in which infrastructure can serve as a glue between different parts of a workflow and sort of like bring them together so that you can do interesting things, or between different individuals within a community so that the infrastructure allows people to connect with each other and like share their work or organize with one another, or glue at the level of infrastructure that brings together multiple communities so that they can kind of share what they have learned and share the technology that they work on. Glue and integration is like a big theme for the next 5 years.
It sounds like you've got your work cut out, but we're not going to forget the social engineering that you mentioned as well, because amongst all the technical glue, there's also the human glue that we need, isn't there?
That's like a really critical piece of it, actually. And I probably should have clarified. When I say infrastructure in the context of what I just said, it's really a combination of technical and social infrastructure, because at least in my experience, the real stickiness and the longevity of projects comes from the connections that exist between the people that are involved in the project. They form their own distinct communities and they build relationships with each other. 2i2c is also in an interesting vantage point where we have this kind of high level view and relationship to a bunch of different communities. And so trying to find ways to encourage more healthy community growth using the technical infrastructure as a kind of like backbone that is common amongst all of them so that they have technical workflows that are shared between them. But then finding ways that we can use 2i2c's like human resources to encourage knowledge sharing and collaboration and just getting people talking to each other. And I think that in and of itself would have a huge impact, because right now there are lots of communities out there thinking about Jupyter Hub. There are lots of communities running their own Jupyter Hubs independently, and they're experimenting and learning what's the right way to do this, right? Like what is a useful way to bring technology together for this particular purpose. But they're all kind of learning independently of one another. And like maybe they go to a conference every year and they like chit chat with each other about what worked and what didn't. I think an organization like 2i2c is in a unique place to provide that social glue, watch one community succeed, learn from it relatively quickly, and then systematize that and push that learning out to all of the other communities via guidance and tutorials or changes to the infrastructure.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. And thanks very much for the insight into 2i2c. Sounds like a very interesting challenge ahead. And I wish you all the best for the future, Chris.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, as you've heard, there's a lot to cover when it comes to open source organizations and communities. And so later in this season, we will hear from another example, notably from the team of scikit-learn, the hugely popular machine learning library. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.